Which is better, taking your garden seeds and sowing them directly into your garden beds, or taking your seeds and starting them indoors in seed trays or pots and then transplanting them out into your garden? There are advantages and disadvantages to each. Join me today as I discuss sowing the seeds directly outside versus starting early and then transplanting into your garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I'll begin by saying that most of the seeds that I sow for my summer garden, I direct sow outside directly into my garden beds. But I also start a substantial number of my plants in my grow room, in trays and in pots for transplanting outside. Now, it can seem complicated, but it's really quite easy, and I'll discuss this over the course of the video. Begin by reading what the seed packet tells you to do. When I read the directions on these seed packets, I find that this fennel, okra, sunflower, leek, and watermelon are all quite specific about sowing directly into the garden beds. Other seeds like this broccoli, this lemon balm, tomato, cabbage, pepper, they're specific about starting the seeds indoors and then transplanting outside. So why the difference? Well, let's go ahead and read the seed packet because that will give us some clues. This California Wonder pepper says start seeds indoors 8 weeks before transplanting, which can safely be done once the temperatures stay above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This habanero chili pepper says start inside 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, with plenty of heat for successful germination. And this golden acre cabbage says sow indoors 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date, keeping the growing medium at 75 degrees until the seeds germinate. This Black Russian sunflower says sow directly outside after last frost date in a sunny spot. This emerald okra says sow directly outside after soil reaches 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And this Georgia rattlesnake watermelon says once soil reaches 70 degrees Fahrenheit, sow directly outside. Soil temperature is a more important factor for germination than many gardeners realize. So whether you're starting indoors and then transplanting or direct sowing outside, the temperature matters. Not just the air temperature, but the soil temperature. When starting indoors, we tend to have more control over our temperatures. All seeds have a very specific temperature range for germination. Too cold, they won't germinate. Too hot, and they won't germinate. As a gardener, starting my seeds indoors, I have my grow area. I can keep the temperature pretty consistent, especially when I use a heat mat to warm up my soil. You can achieve the same thing on a kitchen table indoors. It's the control that we have as gardeners that enables us to give the seed exactly what it needs. Sometimes the directions may seem confusing because they'll give you the option of whether you start the seeds indoors ahead of time and then transplant, or whether you choose to do the direct sowing. For example, this Georgia rattlesnake watermelon says to start outdoors directly when it hits 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but it also says in cool climates, start indoors 2 to 4 weeks before transplanting outdoors. And this emerald okra says that you could do the same thing. Sow directly outside or start indoors 3 to 4 weeks before transplanting. There's important caveats with both of these. The okra says take care not to disturb the roots when transplanting. And this watermelon says, do not disturb the tender roots when transplanting. And this is an important aspect that Lika, Mala, and I always follow. How well does the plant transplant? And for many of our vegetable plants like these, when we transplant, we run the risk of transplant shock. By damaging the roots, we can stunt the growth of the plant, and in the worst examples, actually kill the plant. So these are the ones that I prefer to direct sow because I don't have to worry at all about transplanting. The seed goes in the ground, it germinates, and when it begins growing, those roots immediately find a home in my garden soil. I do have the option, and I actually have the materials to start some of those seeds ahead of time. For the ones that don't like having their roots disturbed, I mostly direct sow them. But if I choose to start early to gain an extra 3 to 4 weeks in my very short season here in Colorado, I can use a pot like this, made with cow manure or peat or cocoa coir. The idea is that you can start your seed in a container like this, and then when you transplant, you don't need to remove it from the pot. You put these containers completely into the soil at planting. You greatly reduce the likelihood of damaging the roots. So why not just go ahead and start all of your plants indoors and then transplant into the garden when the conditions are appropriate? A lot of gardeners do that, especially those that live in those cold, drizzly climates. They need that extra 3 to 4 weeks to start indoors and then go outside. For me, my summers come on relatively quickly, and so while I have to wait through the spring before I put anything out in my cold Colorado garden, once it warms up, it stays hot, and I can put the seeds directly outdoors and get maximum growth right away. And above all, it's easiest to direct sow. All I have to do is just take a seed and put it in the ground, and then wait for the germination and wait for the plant to grow. For the indoor starting, I have to maybe make that extra effort with a heat mat. I have to keep the overall conditions right. I have to have lights to promote the growth of the seedlings. And then at some point, I have to bring those plants outside, harden them up to prepare them for my outdoor weather conditions, and then put them into the ground. I'm a relatively lazy gardener, believe it or not. I would much rather direct sow my whole garden if I could, because it's just so much easier. The issue is that I can't do that. Even with my hot, dry summers, I do have to start some of my seeds ahead of time. That's because some of these plants just take a long time to grow. I can take a cucumber seed or a squash seed and put it directly into the soil and expect that I'm going to have a harvest maybe in 2.5 or 3 months. But for a lot of these other indoor started seeds, it takes much longer than that. For example, let's talk about the chili peppers. The seed packet may say to start indoors 8 to 10 weeks before the last frost date, but then we have to wait an additional 2 weeks for the soil to warm up and to harden off the plants. So by the time they actually make it into the soil, they're already 3 months old. And then after they're transplanted, it can take another 3 months before we reach the point that we can harvest those plants. That means from seed to harvest is 6 months long. Many of us do not have a season that allows for a plant to go from seed to fruit in 6 months. So we have to start the peppers and the eggplants and the tomatoes indoors if we expect to have them in our garden. There are a lot of plants in my garden that aren't so finicky, requiring such a long time, and I take advantage of that. Lettuce, radish, spinach, peas, they grow so quickly that I really gain no advantage by starting them indoors and transplanting. And coincidentally, those plants, along with most of the brassicas, can germinate and grow in cool conditions. So I can direct sow those type of plants outdoors and get at least one, sometimes two harvests before it's warm enough to bring the other plants outside for transplanting. That gives me a much longer period to enjoy my garden and to have those harvests. We mustn't forget to think about the costs associated with direct sowing or starting indoors and transplanting. Of course, the easiest approach is just to take a packet of seeds and direct sow them. And that's it. Just the cost of the packet is the only expense we have when we put them out into our garden. When we start something that requires the time, now we need a pot, and we need some potting soil, and we need some lights, and maybe we need a stand to put the pots on, and maybe we need even bigger pots for those plants that are going to need more soil during the time that they're indoors. That's a big difference between just popping a seed outside and then having this whole setup inside. But depending on the type of plant you grow, there are costs if you focus on the direct sowing. If you're not starting your tomatoes and your peppers from seed indoors ahead of time, then you're probably buying them as plants for transplanting. All of my peppers and tomatoes, I start from seed. So the only expense for the actual plant is buying the seed for that plant. Sure, there's the initial expense of setting up a grow operation, but from here on out, there's very little expense associated with that. So I buy a seed packet and I can grow it without having to pay the cost of a plant at a nursery or a grow center. You can see that when you put all of this together, there are reasons to direct sow some plants, and there are reasons to start your seeds indoors and then transplant, or buy your plants and then transplant. You're the one that's in a best position to decide which is best for you. I do both. I do combinations of all of it to save costs, but also to give me that enjoyment and that experience as a gardener so that I can do more and more of it. Think about it. Consider what you're not doing now and maybe try doing some more of the other options so you can get that experience as well. If you want to learn more about some of the ways that I start my seeds indoors, go ahead and watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.